You're standing in the cereal aisle. Your 3-year-old is on the floor, screaming, kicking, face red, fists pounding the linoleum because you said no to a box with a cartoon tiger on it. Strangers are staring. One woman gives you that look. You feel your face go hot with embarrassment, certain this means something is wrong with your child or wrong with you. But the real answer is far stranger than anything that woman's look was suggesting. That meltdown on the floor isn't a discipline failure. It isn't a sign your child is spoiled or that you've done something wrong as a parent. It's something far older than parenting advice, far older than grocery stores themselves. What if tantrums are actually a survival skill, one written into the architecture of the human brain long before anyone ever stood in a checkout line? Start with a question most parents never get to ask out loud. Why does almost every toddler on Earth, in every culture, in every era, go through a phase of explosive, seemingly irrational rage? Is that really just bad luck, repeated across billions of children? There's a smaller, quieter struggle sitting underneath the tantrum too, one that's easy to miss in the middle of the noise. By the time a child reaches this age, they understand far more language than they can produce. They can follow instructions, recognize options, form clear preferences, want specific things with real intensity. But the words available to express all of that are still painfully limited. Imagine knowing precisely what you want, feeling it as strongly as any adult feels desire or frustration, and having almost no reliable way to put it into words fast enough for anyone to understand before the feeling becomes unbearable. That gap between sophisticated wanting and primitive expressing sits at the center of a huge share of toddler meltdowns, layered directly on top of everything still developing underneath it. Adults forget this gap quickly, because by adulthood, language and feeling move at roughly the same speed. For a toddler, they're moving at two completely different speeds, and the meltdown is often what happens in the widening space between them. To understand what's actually happening, you have to look inside the architecture of a toddler's brain, not at the behavior on the surface. The psychiatrist Daniel Siegel built a framework that makes this easier to picture. He describes the brain as having an upstairs and a downstairs. The downstairs brain handles basic survival functions, strong emotion, instinct, reaction. The upstairs brain handles judgment, planning, impulse control, the ability to pause before reacting. In an adult, those two regions are wired together by years of development, allowing the upstairs to calm the downstairs when emotion spikes. In a toddler, that wiring barely exists yet. The prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for regulation and impulse control, won't be fully connected until well into a person's 20s. This isn't a loose estimate. Brain imaging studies tracking development across childhood and adolescence have repeatedly shown that myelination, the process of insulating neural connections so signals travel faster and more reliably, continues in the prefrontal regions far longer than almost anywhere else in the brain, often not finishing until a person is well past their 20th birthday. A 3-year-old isn't choosing to ignore self control. The hardware for that self control, in any reliable sense, simply hasn't finished being built and won't finish for another 2 decades. When the downstairs brain floods with frustration, there's almost nothing upstairs yet strong enough to intervene. Doesn't that change how the screaming on the floor looks to you? It helps to see this as part of a continuous system, rather than something that appears out of nowhere at age 2. An infant's cry recruits care through sheer helplessness, a small body unable to do anything except signal distress and wait for a response. As that same child gains mobility, strength, and the beginnings of will, the recruitment system doesn't disappear. It scales up. The cry becomes a scream. The helpless waiting becomes active protest, sometimes physical, sometimes directed, often loud enough to be heard across an entire house or store. Underneath both stages sits the same basic evolutionary logic. Get noticed, get a response. Don't let the signal go unanswered. Just expressed through whatever tools a developing body happens to have available at that particular age. Here's where the science gets even more specific and considerably stranger. The researcher Michael Portugal spent years studying tantrums, the way a scientist studies a chemical reaction, recording the actual sounds toddlers make during meltdowns and analyzing them second by second using audio spectrograms, the same kind of tool used to break down music into its individual frequencies. What he found wasn't chaos, it was structure. A tantrum, it turns out, almost always follows a predictable arc, one visible clearly enough on a sound graph that researchers could identify its phases just by looking at the shape of the recording without ever seeing the child who made it. It typically begins with what Portugal calls the anger phase: loud, intense, physical, screaming, hitting, throwing, stomping. This phase is sharp and short lived by design, more like a flare than a sustained fire, often lasting less than a minute even at its most explosive. Then, almost like clockwork, it transitions into a second phase: sadness. The crying softens, the pitch drops, the child starts reaching for comfort, for contact, for a parent's arms instead of distance from them. Portugal's recordings showed this pattern again and again. Anger first, then sadness, then resolution, almost as if the tantrum were running a script the child had no conscious control over writing, and importantly, almost no ability to skip ahead in. That structure matters enormously. It suggests a tantrum isn't random venting. It's closer to a release valve with a built in shape, one that needs to run its full course to actually finish discharging. Interrupted too early, with punishment, with isolation, with a parent matching the child's volume, and the system doesn't necessarily reset faster. Portugal's work suggested the opposite was often true. Adding a new emotional input, like a parent's own anger, during the anger phase tended to restart the clock, sending the whole arc back to its beginning, rather than skipping it forward. So if tantrums have structure, if they follow a biological script, playing out the same way in toddlers everywhere, the next question becomes unavoidable. Why would evolution build something so loud, so disruptive, so seemingly costly, directly into early childhood? This is where the neuroscientist Jaak Panksepp's work becomes essential. Panksepp spent decades mapping what he called the core emotional systems shared across mammals, ancient circuits buried deep in the brain that existed long before language, long before complex thought. He identified several of these systems through careful experimental work, naming them in capital letters to mark them as distinct biological networks rather than vague feelings, seeking the drive to explore and pursue. Fear, the circuit that responds to threat. Play, the circuit behind rough wrestling and social bonding in young mammals. And rage, a circuit that activates specifically when a goal is blocked, when something desired is taken away, when an animal or a human toddler hits a wall between what it wants and what it's allowed to have. According to Panksepp's research, that rage circuit isn't a malfunction. It's ancient machinery present in every mammal capable of wanting something and being denied it, traceable down into brain structures shared with species separated from humans by tens of millions of years of evolution. In a toddler, that circuit fires with almost nothing standing in its way, because the regulatory systems that would normally dampen it, the very same upstairs brain Daniel Siegel described, simply haven't matured enough to do much dampening yet. Picture what that combination actually produces: a brain wired with a fully functional, ancient rage circuit, paired with almost no functional breaks. That's not a flaw in your particular child. That's every toddler, everywhere, at roughly the same age, hitting roughly the same biological wall. But why would a species evolve a stage of childhood defined by that exact combination? Wouldn't quieter, calmer toddlers have been easier to keep alive? It also helps to know this pattern isn't uniquely human. Primatologists observing chimpanzees in the wild, including the long-running fieldwork made famous by Jane Goodall at Gombe in Tanzania, have documented young chimps throwing displays strikingly similar to a human toddler's tantrum: screaming, flailing limbs, throwing themselves to the ground when denied something wanted. Whether that's continued access to a mother's body, a piece of food, or an object another chimp is holding. The behavior shows up across multiple primate species, with immature self control systems and a goal that's just been blocked, which suggests this isn't some strange glitch unique to human parenting. It's closer to a deep shared inheritance running through an entire branch of the evolutionary tree, present wherever a young, dependent primate brain meets sudden frustration with not yet enough wiring to manage it gracefully. Goodall herself described these displays with a kind of plain familiarity, the same exasperated affection any parent watching their own child fall apart over something small would likely recognize instantly. Here's the counterintuitive twist, the one that should genuinely change how you see that cereal aisle meltdown. Researchers studying child development through an evolutionary lens have pointed out that the tantrum years line up almost exactly with a uniquely dangerous window in early human life. Around age 2 or 3, a child gains real mobility, the ability to walk, run, climb, wander, explore terrain on their own for the first time. At the very same age, judgment about danger is essentially non existent. A toddler can outrun a parent's reach long before they can understand what a cliff edge, a fire, or a predator actually means. Picture that window playing out in an ancestral camp rather than a modern living room. A newly mobile toddler free of the constant carrying that defined the first year of life, suddenly able to wander toward the edge of camp, toward the riverbank, toward the embers of a fire, towards thick brush that might hide a snake, or worse. That child has no concept of consequence yet, no internal brake telling them this particular direction is dangerous. The only thing standing between curiosity and disaster in that environment was an adult noticing in time and intervening fast. A toddler who could be redirected instantly, loudly, dramatically away from a fire's edge stood a far better chance of surviving to adulthood than one who wandered off in total silence, unnoticed until it was already too late. That combination, new mobility plus zero judgment, is arguably the single most dangerous stretch of early human development. And what does a tantrum actually do mechanically in that context? It's loud, it's impossible to ignore. It guarantees an adult's full attention, instantly, regardless of what else that adult was doing a moment before. A toddler throwing a screaming, thrashing fit in the middle of a forager camp wasn't background noise easily tuned out. It was a 5 alarm signal demanding anyone nearby, redirect their full focus immediately. Seen that way, a tantrum starts to look less like dysfunction and more like an alarm system, evolved precisely for a stage of life when a child's body had outpaced a child's judgment, and survival depended on adults noticing that gap loudly enough to intervene. There's something else here worth sitting with. The anthropologist Sarah Blaffer-Hrdy, whose work on cooperative breeding reshaped how scientists think about infant crying, made a related point about early childhood more broadly. Human children, she argued, evolved inside groups where multiple adults were watching, available, and responsive, not just one isolated caregiver trying to track a fast moving toddler alone in a quiet house. A scream that recruits one adult's attention in a busy, crowded camp is doing exactly the job evolution built it for. The same scream, recruiting the attention of one exhausted parent standing alone in a fluorescent lit grocery store, surrounded by strangers instead of allies, lands completely differently, even though the underlying signal hasn't changed at all. This sits alongside a broader concept evolutionary biologists call costly signaling, the idea that some behaviors evolve specifically because they're expensive, loud, and hard to fake, which is exactly what makes them effective as honest signals. A whisper can be ignored. A scream that drains energy, draws every eye in the vicinity, and risks the screamer's own dignity is much harder to dismiss as background noise. Across many species, the animals least able to defend themselves directly often evolve the loudest, costliest signals for getting attention precisely because volume substitutes for power they don't yet have. A toddler, small, weak, unable to reason or negotiate in words, yet may be running a version of exactly that strategy, just played out across the linoleum of a cereal aisle instead of a savanna. There's a related pattern worth noticing too, one that shows up constantly but rarely gets connected to its likely origin. A huge share of toddler meltdowns center on resources, a specific cup, a particular toy, the last piece of a snack, who got to a chair first. Ancestral childhood almost certainly involved real recurring scarcity. Food that wasn't always plentiful, objects and tools that existed in limited supply, attention from caregivers that had to be split among siblings and cousins of different ages, all competing for the same finite pool. In an environment like that, a child with no language sophisticated enough to argue a case and no physical strength to simply take what they wanted had exactly one functional tool available for negotiating access to something contested: volume, insistence. A display dramatic enough that giving in became easier than holding the line. It's not flattering to think about it this way, but it tracks. Toddlers escalate hardest over exactly the kinds of things: food, toys, attention that would have been genuinely scarce and genuinely worth fighting loudly for across most of human history. That competitive backdrop helps explain why sibling tantrums often look and sound different from solo ones. A toddler melting down alone over a denied snack is running a fairly simple negotiation with one adult. A toddler melting down in front of a sibling who's currently holding the toy in question is running something closer to a public contest, with an audience whose response comforting the loser, intervening on behalf of the winner, watching with interest, shapes the outcome almost as much as the original object did. That added layer of social pressure, performing the stress in front of a rival, rather than simply feeling it in private, may be part of why sibling conflicts so reliably produce some of the loudest, most theatrical meltdowns parents ever witness. Full of glances checking whether anyone is watching closely enough for the display to actually work. Anthropologists and developmental psychologists studying communities with vastly different parenting customs, different discipline styles, different expectations about how children should behave in public, have still found tantrums showing up reliably at roughly the same age, following roughly the same emotional shape. Almost everywhere they've looked. That consistency across wildly different cultural environments is exactly what you'd expect from something biologically wired rather than something taught, copied, or caused by any particular parenting mistake. Doesn't that reframe the embarrassment a little? The tantrum isn't malfunctioning. The setting it's happening in is unlike almost anything it evolved to be heard inside. None of this means every toddler tantrums identically, or that the intensity is fixed and unchangeable. Hunger, exhaustion, overstimulation, and illness all lower the threshold at which the rage circuit fires, which is part of why a meltdown over a cereal box on a normal, well rested morning looks so different from the same meltdown at the end of a long day with a skipped nap. The underlying machinery is universal. The threshold for triggering it shifts constantly, hour by hour, depending on factors that have far more to do with biology than character. Sleep debt and blood sugar doing more to predict a meltdown than anything resembling stubbornness or manipulation. It's worth knowing, too, that the very phrase terrible twos is a relatively recent cultural invention, not an ancient label handed down through generations of universal parenting wisdom. The framing of this developmental stage as something to dread, something to be endured or fixed, says more about a particular cultural moment, one increasingly built around quiet public spaces, strict scheduling, and high expectations for early self control, than it does about anything inherently wrong with 2 and 3 year olds themselves. Earlier generations, and many cultures today, simply expected this stage to be loud, disruptive, and short lived, without attaching quite so much shame to its arrival. There's another layer to the counterintuitive twist, one that tends to surprise parents the most. Tantrums often get bigger, louder, more frequent, in the safest environments a child has, usually at home, usually with the parent the child trusts most. That's not a sign that home life is somehow making things worse. It's closer to the opposite. A nervous system only fully lets an intense emotional release run its complete course in a place it judges safe enough to fall apart in. The teacher at daycare who never sees a single meltdown isn't necessarily a better caregiver. She may simply be a context the child's nervous system hasn't marked as safe enough to fully discharge inside of yet. This shows up constantly in the small, specific stories parents tell each other. A toddler who holds it together for an entire school day, navigating frustration after frustration with something close to composure, then falls apart completely over a broken cracker the moment they're back in a parent's car. Teachers sometimes describe this exact child as easygoing, low maintenance, a dream in the classroom. Parents hearing that description often feel a fresh wave of confusion, even guilt, wondering what they're doing differently to produce such different behavior. The honest answer has little to do with technique. The car and the parent inside it is simply the one place that child's body has decided is safe enough to stop holding everything together. Think about what that means for you specifically. If your child saves the biggest tantrums for you, that's not failure showing up in your parenting. It might be closer to evidence of trust, however exhausting that trust feels to be on the receiving end of at 6 in the evening after a long day. Now here's the modern mirror, the part that connects all of this directly back to that cereal aisle. For most of human history, a screaming toddler wasn't witnessed by strangers, passing silent judgment in a quiet, brightly lit space designed for efficient shopping. A screaming toddler was witnessed by an entire camp of people who had all, at some point, either thrown their own version of that exact tantrum or watched a dozen other children throw one before. There was no concept of a stranger's disapproving glance, because there were no real strangers, and there was no cultural script demanding that small children behave like quiet miniature adults in public spaces. Modern environments invented something ancient parenting never had to contend with at this scale: an audience of total strangers, unfamiliar with your child, your history, your effort, silently scoring your competence in real time based on 45 seconds of floor based screaming. That judgment isn't ancient. It's a strange recent layer added on top of an ancient biological event, and it's almost entirely responsible for the shame a tantrum produces today that it likely never produced for most of human history. That layer has only gotten heavier in recent years. Phones now turn a public tantrum into potential footage, a clip a stranger might film and post without a second thought, captioned with some version of parenting fail for an audience of people who will never meet you, never meet your child, and never know anything about the day you've both had. The pressure to perform calm, controlled parenting in public isn't just imagined, it's now backed by the very real possibility of being recorded, judged, and shared by people operating from a place your ancestors never had to defend themselves against: the disapproval of total strangers with cameras. There's one more piece worth understanding, because it changes how you might interpret the specific word toddlers reach for most during a tantrum: the relentless, often shouted no. The psychologist Eric Erikson, building one of the earliest influential frameworks for psychosocial development, described early childhood as centered on a tension between autonomy and shame, a stage where a young child's central task is discovering, often loudly and clumsily, that they exist as a separate person with their own will, distinct from a parent's will. Saying no, insisting, refusing, isn't just frustration over a cereal box. It's frequently an early, unsophisticated rehearsal of selfhood itself, a developing person testing, for the very first time, whether their own preferences carry any real weight in the world. That task doesn't make the floor any less sticky or the screaming any less loud, but it does suggest there's something genuinely productive happening underneath the chaos, not just noise for its own sake. This connects to a concept developmental psychologists call co regulation, the idea that young children don't learn to calm themselves in isolation. They learn it by repeatedly borrowing a calmer nervous system from someone nearby, again and again, until the pattern eventually becomes internalized as their own. Every time you stay steady next to a screaming child, instead of escalating to match them, you're not just managing one incident. You're functioning as an external regulatory system the child's own brain hasn't finished building, slowly lending out a version of calm that over years of repetition becomes something the child can eventually produce on their own, the same way a muscle eventually strengthens enough to work without support. There's a practical thread worth pulling from all of this too. If a tantrum genuinely is a structured release, anger phase moving towards sadness phase, moving toward resolution, the most useful thing a parent can often do isn't stopping the eruption from happening at all. It's staying close enough, calm enough, present enough to let the script run its course without adding fuel, without trying to out yell a downstairs brain that has no upstairs brain online yet to negotiate with. Punishment in the middle of the anger phase rarely speeds up the system. It just adds another input for an already overwhelmed circuit to process, often restarting the very phase you were trying to shorten. A parent who can stay quiet and physically near, even while feeling embarrassed or rattled inside, is doing more biological work in that moment than any clever phrase or perfectly timed consequence ever could. In practice, that often looks far less dramatic than it sounds. Lowering your own voice instead of raising it, getting physically closer rather than threatening distance or isolation. Naming the emotion plainly. You're really angry right now, not because a 3-year old can process a vocabulary lesson mid meltdown, but because a calm voice nearby, even one, offering words that won't be consciously understood yet, gives the nervous system something steady to organize around while it works through its own arc. None of this requires getting it perfect. The goal isn't engineering a tantrum free childhood, which isn't biologically available to you anyway. It's riding out a wired, predictable storm without accidentally extending its length. That doesn't mean every tantrum should be tolerated endlessly, or that limits stop mattering. Limits still matter immensely, maybe more than ever, because a toddler with an active rage circuit and no upstairs brakes genuinely needs an outside boundary holding steady while their own internal one is still being constructed. What it does mean is that the limit and the meltdown that follows it aren't necessarily signs that something has gone wrong. Sometimes they're simply the predictable biological cost of enforcing a boundary inside a nervous system that hasn't finished building its own. None of this is an argument for permissiveness either, for handing over the cereal box just to make the noise stop faster. The cost of giving in consistently is real, teaching a developing brain that escalation reliably produces what it wants, tends to reinforce exactly the behavior a parent is hoping will fade with age. The reframe here isn't about removing boundaries. It's about removing the layer of shame and self blame that so often gets attached to the predictable biological aftermath of holding one. You can say no to the cereal box and still understand that the screaming which follows isn't a referendum on your worth as a parent. Both things are true at the exact same time, and holding both at once, the firmness and the compassion, is arguably the entire job. So the next time you find yourself standing over a screaming child on a floor somewhere in front of strangers, face hot with embarrassment, try holding two things in mind at once. That scream is ancient, structured, and running exactly the script a mammalian brain was built to run when something wanted is suddenly out of reach. And the shame you feel watching it happen in public isn't ancient at all. It's a recent invention, built by an audience your ancestors never had to perform in front of. Your toddler isn't broken, your parenting isn't failing. A brain with a fully wired alarm system and barely any brakes yet is doing exactly what evolution built it to do, loudly enough that for nearly all of human history, someone was guaranteed to come running, drawn in by a signal that simply could not be ignored. There's a quieter implication worth carrying forward from all of this, one that has very little to do with technique and everything to do with how you talk to yourself in the middle of the storm. The instinct to feel like a tantrum reflects something broken in you. Some failure of patience or discipline or love is almost always misplaced. What's actually unfolding in front of you is a few 100,000 years of inherited machinery doing its job inside a body that's only been alive for 3 short years in a setting, the modern world. That machinery was never built to anticipate. You didn't create the rage circuit. You didn't design the slow 20-year timeline for prefrontal wiring. You're simply the adult standing closest to it when it activates, which happens to be the single most important role available in that moment. The same role an alloparent or watchful relative would have felt around any ancient fire. It might help too to remember that this exact phase, however endless it feels while you're living inside it, has an expiration date written directly into the same biology that produced it. As the prefrontal cortex slowly comes online over the coming years, as language catches up to wanting, as the upstairs brain gradually builds enough wiring to start negotiating with the downstairs one, the volume and frequency of these displays will fall away almost entirely on their own, the way a fever breaks once the underlying process it was responding to has finally resolved. You're not managing a permanent condition. You're weathering a temporary, biologically scheduled storm that every single human child has weathered before yours, and that every single one of them eventually grew out of without needing to be cured of anything at all. In every culture, in every era, long before anyone ever thought to write a parenting book about it. And maybe that's worth remembering the next time the floor of a store, or a kitchen, or a car seat becomes the stage for something loud and overwhelming. You're not failing to control a child who should already know better. You're standing next to a small, ancient alarm system, doing exactly what it was built to do, at exactly the age it was built to do it, in a world that simply forgot, somewhere along the way, what all that noise was actually for.